Internet man, what do you think about the chances of Loki joining Blackbeard and his gang if he figures out Rocks was his father? Well, that really does depend on how this flashback pans out. If we're talking about the Loki that we're seeing right here, right now as a child, then I would put the chances at kind of close to 100%, because Blackbeard does thoroughly embody and uphold the Rocks Beck will and philosophy, but what we still need to see is how much influence that Harold has on his son. In the last video, I put that influence at about 99% in favor of Rocks and about 1% at Harold, but Harold still has a lot of room to grow. Loki could easily get free, make all sorts of chaos in the world, and be seduced by the anarchy of Blackbeard, but he could also come around to Harold's way of seeing the world and pursue a path of stability rather than destruction. And then, of course, there is the Luffy factor. Right now, in the modern day, it does seem like Loki wants to follow the path of Rocks, but this is Luffy's opportunity to show Loki that other avenues are available. And that could be why Oda has chosen to have us face Emu pretty damn directly in this arc, as we now know that Emu was an opponent that even Rocks Beck avoided getting into a fight with, but I cannot see Luffy making that same choice, whether that is wise or not that. Because if Emu's gonna go off and be a bit of a prick, then Luffy is gonna try and punch him no matter what. So Loki could see that as a bit of an inspirational moment of taking a stand against the world and even find a third way forward that's closer to embodying Luffy's philosophy. So I guess my answer is, because this is One Piece, as cool as it would be, it does feel a bit dark, maybe not dark, very bitter to have Loki join Blackbeard, especially after Luffy's identified him as just such a swell guy, which we should note Luffy did not do with Blackbeard at any stage. Even when Luffy thought that Blackbeard was a complete nobody, he still hated him on sight. So ultimately, I've got to trust in Luffy's judgment and say that Loki's gonna end up on our side in the end. Rocks basically went to Emu's house, raided the fridge, took a can of beer, drank it, threw it to the floor, and then told Emu to clean it up and left. Yes, and not only that, but he didn't even take his shoes off when he went inside. Harold turned out to be much stronger than I had imagined, going strike for strike with the man who just killed a Navy admiral. So not to power scale too much, but the way that Oda portrayed this clash set Rocks and Harold up as rough equals, like he did with Whitebeard and Roger. And should the two of them have continued to fight, we could have seen a multi-day battle. But the two of them, they immediately sized each other up and earned each other's respect from just that one strike. It's sort of like when you go out in public and you're wearing a one-piece shirt and you walk past someone else also wearing a one-piece shirt, and the two of you share a knowing glance of respect, bonding without a single word spoken. And I'm not sure if I should be surprised whether Harold's as powerful or not. The issue for us, and I guess the issue for him when he was younger, was that there was just no one else in existence physically capable of properly testing Harold. We had no idea how high Harold's ceiling goes, but apparently it goes to about the maximum height as outlined in the fictional pirate building code, which is actually quite a terrifying thought if Harold does lose control of that power and, as Mr. Rocks predicted, give in to his ancient giant nature. Harold going berserk has the potential to end the entire nation of Elbaf, not just in terms of physical destruction, but also spiritually in all of the progress that they've now made as a society. And by proxy, this does also hype quite a bit the power of a certain Loki, who we've spent a fair bit of time with now, but we've still yet to see him in an unshackled fight. And also something I very much looked over in this chapter, so much insane stuff happens, but in addition to all of the everything, Harold jumped off the red line, which is wild. That's like a 10-kilometer drop. But this, I think, is an intentional nod to Loki, who has now survived 2 falls from the Sun Realm into the underworld, which may even be a similar distance from the top of the red line to sea level. We're not quite sure. All we know is that Elbaf is big. But I do like Oda acknowledging that if we're going to be all invulnerable to fall damage, then we can use it as a handy escape plan. And something else I find quite cool is that Harold was asked to join the Rocks Pirates, which was Loki's dream. He even fought Rocks to try and become part of his crew, but Harold flat out rejected the offer. Meanwhile, right now we have a potential offer on the table for Loki to join the Straw Hats, and Loki is giving the Harold reaction of "No way, that is a stupid idea, I have other things to do." So even if Loki doesn't join the crew, it's nice to see those little historical parallels. Moments where a choice could have been made to go down a path that would have radically changed everything. I think the funniest thing that no one is mentioning is that Harold snuck into the Reverie, lol. Imagine a man the size of a mountain with horns sneaking anywhere. So yeah, it does take a little bit to buy this. The explanation we have is that one of the kings Harold made friends with snuck Harold in as one of his soldiers, and unless there was some sort of magical fruit powers involved, you would have to think that the king claimed that he just found a giant willing to be loyal to his kingdom, which is pretty risky business, because judging by how St. Charles reacted to Shirahoshi, I want to say that eventually one of the world nobles would have been pretty keen to make an ancient giant one of their slaves due to his exotic nature and ultra rare value. Harold himself says that he probably would have been imprisoned if not for the actions of Rocks, but I think it could have been much worse than that. Although we should not forget the lengths that Harold went to in order to have a chance to communicate with the world government, because that is almost certainly going to come back around, as the Holy Knight seemed to have known Harold personally, so at some point in this flashback the world government are likely going to reach out to him, and Harold will be overjoyed thinking that matey, yes, this is a diplomatic breakthrough, and then something tragedy will ensue. It's so nice to see the Davy Back Fight again. I just love it to see things from the past which are still relevant. Almost nothing in One Piece is a one-off, and I think almost everything in the pre-time skip has now come full circle. And not only that, but continues to go around the circle and lap itself, much like the recent GLR revelation. And I'm not sure that this is the last time that we'll be hearing about the Davy Back Fight. It was always suspected that Rocks recruited his crew through these games, but the way he's been described is that he did it for the love of the sport and to embody the ideals of Davy Jones, who may or may not have existed in this world. And depending on how much of that will has been passed on to Blackbeard, it's not inconceivable to see him offering Luffy a Davy Back Fight in the future, just one with infinitely higher stakes than against Foxy on Long Ring Longland. Because if multiple people arrive near or around Laugh Tale at the same time, or say they need one road poneglyph that all of the others have but they don't, then the most piratesome way possible to settle those differences would be through a Davy Back Fight. Can we talk about the Sabo and Rocks Reverie parallels though? Both invaded Marijuana, both bested admirals, and both saw Emu and lived to tell the tale. So Sabo stocks are definitely very, very high right now, but I'm not sure if this is an intentional parallel to Rocks though. I don't think so, because Sabo just has a very different story happening with an extremely different persona and desires, but something that does get a bit underrated is his current status as the Flame Emperor, because if there was one other similarity that I would grant Sabo and Rocks, it is that Sabo is becoming a rapidly rising force of disruption, and not entirely consensually either. He has the nations that rebelled as part of the Eight Nation Revolution almost worshipping him as a god, which makes me a little bit nervous because that is exactly what the world government does. So I don't know if these nations are replacing one false god for another. But Sabo now has this emperor-scale force behind him, specifically behind him, not Dragon. And at the very least, the kind of chaos and destruction that this growing flame is likely to cause would give Rocks plenty of enjoyment from wherever his spirit is keeping an eye on the world from. Man on the internet, why did so many pirates in the past, like Roger and Blackbeard's era, emphasize swords and haki rather than devil fruit powers? It seems that after Roger's era, pirates found it easier to obtain devil fruits than during his time. I don't think the devil fruits are easier to acquire in the modern day, especially since so many of the most powerful ones have now been taken and held for decades. But there is something to be said for the idea that when you look back on the era of legends, the time of Roger and Rocks, the devil fruit users are heavily stacked into former members of the Rocks pirates. Whitebeard, Big Mom, Kaido, Shiki, Stussy, they're almost more of an orchid than they are a pirate crew with all of the fruit they possess. Whereas if you look at the other legends of that time, your Rogers, your Rayleighs, and your Garbs, they opted not to indulge in fictional fruit. So it starts to create quite a clear divide that you could almost kind of categorize as good and evil, but only because devil fruits are called devil fruits. But you've got the most notorious and the most evil of pirate crews that almost destroyed the world government, composed of cursed devils with supernatural powers, and everywhere else you have these noble human warriors standing up to those devils with nothing but their willpower and maybe a sharp bit of metal here and there. Although it's not a very clean divide. For example, Sengoku is obviously a devil fruit user, but for the most part, the dominance of devil fruits in the world of piracy does seem to have spawned directly from the remnants of the Rocks pirates, which makes me wonder if way back then Rocks had a similar plan as to what Blackbeard is doing right now. If devil fruits were harder to acquire in the old days, then did Rocks go on a campaign to steal as many fictional fruits as possible to feed to his crew, in the same way that Blackbeard is actively seeking them out for his crew? And do we say have Rocks to thank for Whitebeard being the user of the Guru Guru no Mi? And it would definitely explain the god Valley incident, where a treasure was allegedly stolen from Hachinosu, which is currently assumed to be Kaido's devil fruit, but it could also have been Kuma's fruit or any of the other 4 fruits that we weren't shown. It might just be that simple. The abundance of swords and haki was because this was a time before devil fruits became commonplace in the very top tiers of piracy. And if that was the case, then we do need to ask the question of, did Rocks himself have a devil fruit or even multi-fruits like his son does? Man on the internet, you sir just got accidentally registered to my device voice print. I don't know what it heard you say that triggered it, but you are now a part of my phone. That is excellent news. Triggering devices is always fun, so you know what, let's give this a go. Hey Siri, play Never Gonna Give You Up. Internet man, how far exactly do you think this flashback is going to go? It started as a Loki backstory and now things have gone off the rails. Do you think there's a chance we might just see the God Valley incident right here and now in the next 10 to 15 chapters? I don't think so. Unless, look, there's only one way I could see it happening, which is if Harold or another relevant giant happened to be on God Valley at the time. Because this is ultimately a King Harold flashback and we're being shown the Rocks pirates mostly through his perspective, with a few liberties being taken here and there, like showing Rocks' encounter with Emu. So as soon as the Rocks pirates leave Elbaf, I feel like we lose them from our vision, and the only way to get them back would be for Harold to potentially accept Rocks' offer and take part in the God Valley incident, but that would be a pretty extreme about face from where Harold currently is as a character. Another way I could seeing us get maybe a bit more God Valley content though would be through the eyes of Scopper Gaban, or maybe Shanks retelling the incident, probably more likely the former, but both of them will arrive on Elbaf at some point in this flashback, and you know what I feel a lot more confident about seeing is Shanks versus Loki, which may even be sparked by Loki asking about the God Valley incident and not being hugely pleased with Shanks' retelling of events that he doesn't remember because he was a baby at the time. One thing I'm really liking about this Rocks flashback is how likable Rocks is being. It's so interesting how I'm seeing Rocks' personality shadow Luffy's personality just in a darker way. It is quite perplexing just how likable he is. And after these 2 chapters, I think he is a serious challenger in the next One Piece character popularity poll. He would have to land in the top 20 at the very least, which I find interesting because he's kind of a dick. Rocks is quite a brutal man and even malicious at times. You could potentially genuinely describe him as evil, but where the likability comes from, I think, is in how Rocks exercises his freedom. There is something incredibly compelling about an unbound person who goes wherever they want and does whatever they feel. Rocks is not subject to the rules and restrictions of this planet, and that is a key trait shared by Luffy and one of the things I think we all love most about him. So I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but it's pretty peak escapism. You know, me and everyone else watching this, we're all bound by certain rules and expectations of whichever society it is we happen to live in. So it becomes very compelling to follow figures who break free of those rules and expectations no matter what their motives may be. Luffy's being more pure and innocent and fun, whilst Rocks does seem to have more sinister ideas that he's using his freedom to work towards. But it's the fact that he has that freedom that makes him unbelievably compelling to follow regardless of what he does. And you know what? After getting to know Rocks a little bit more, I can see him potentially being the man that Gloriosa fell in love with and joined the Rocks pirates to pursue, because he does have a certain Luffy charm about him that we know works rather well on Empresses of Amazon Lily. Dear man on the internet, I am a big fan of your content, but unfortunately I am an American viewer and am terrified of measuring anything in a metric system. Could you tell me how much 5 kilometers is in Cyborg Frankie's? You know what? I actually can. So Frankie's post time skip height is exactly 225 centimeters tall, which is about 7 of your feet and 5 of your inch things that you guys use. And if we were to stand Frankie's on top of one another and form our very own super red line, then we would need approximately 2,222 Frankies to cover the distance of 5 kilometers. So that is how far the shockwaves of Rocks versus Harold reached. Over 2,000 Frankies. Man on the internet, how did you feel about the final episode of Kuma's flashback? So genuinely, I think it's one of the best episodes that One Piece has ever produced, which is crazy because a whole third of the episode is anime original stuff, where they reimagine Kuma's life in a very abstract and artful way, but it's done so insanely well. I highly recommend checking it out, and in fact, I highly recommend checking out the anime in general these days. After coming back from their 6-month break and changing series directors, the pacing, it's still a bit of an issue, but it's a lot less noticeable because a lot of the filler and extensions they insert actually feel like substantive content that adds to the the experience rather than the sort of empty fluff that we're used to. When we cut back to the action on Egghead, it'll be interesting to see how they continue to handle that, but the whole Kuma flashback has been shockingly well done. And I've got some more videos in the works about the precise and weirdly impactful differences between how the anime and the manga handled it. The coolest theory I have seen is that Davy Jones was actually Joy Boy's name, and the One Piece is in Davy Jones's locker. So I'll address that second part first. There is one known place in the One Piece world that no one can get to. It's very deep, and I mean like real deep down in the sea. It's where the deep currents eventually carry all ships that fail to escape them right down to the true bottom of the ocean. A process that, according to Brook, takes about 2,000 years to complete because the currents flow so slowly all the way down there. So there's this whole area of the world that's just impossible to access because no one can actually live long enough to get there. But if there was another way to get there without riding the deep current a significantly quicker way, then that would be a pretty great place to hide a certain treasure. With Davy Jones's locker being a term used as a euphemism for the bottom of the sea, so then it could work. And as for Joy Boy himself, if that is indeed his real name, which I don't think it is, even before now it has been speculated that his real name could have been Davy Jones, or even that the D in the Will of D stands for Davy Jones.